There's a mountain in Nova Scotia where the trees grow thick, and the fog never quite lifts. For decades, people in the valley below whispered about the families living up there, families who didn't come down except to buy supplies, families whose children had eyes that didn't quite focus right, families whose bloodlines had twisted back on themselves so many times that the family tree looked more like a wreath. In 1984, a 14-year-old girl walked barefoot down that mountain and told a story that would crack open one of the most disturbing cases of generational abuse in Canadian history. What police found on that mountain wasn't just a crime scene. It was a multi-generational nightmare that had been breeding in isolation for over a century. A pocket of darkness that somehow survived in a modern country, hidden in plain sight. This is the story of the Goler Clan, and what happened when the outside world finally looked inside. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. The mountain community known as Whitehead Road sits in the South Mountain region of Nova Scotia's Annapolis Valley. It's not the kind of place you stumble across by accident. The dirt roads are unmarked, winding through dense forest that seems to swallow sound. By the early 1980s, approximately 60 people lived up there in a cluster of ramshackle homes and trailers, most of them sharing the last name Goler. They were descendants of a man named Charles Goler, who had settled in the area sometime in the late 1800s. What Charles Goler started, whether through intention or simple isolation, was a family that would turn inward, breeding with itself across generations until the genetic consequences became visible in the faces of the children born there. The people in the valley below knew something was wrong on that mountain. Local teachers noticed that Goler children who occasionally appeared in school were developed, mentally delayed, unnaturally fearful, and often covered in bruises that no one could explain. Social workers who attempted visits were turned away, sometimes at gunpoint. The Golers didn't want outsiders asking questions, and for decades, outsiders obliged. It was easier to look away, to let the mountain keep its secrets. But secrets like these don't stay buried forever. They fester. They grow teeth. And eventually, someone finds the courage to speak. In June of 1984, a teenage girl appeared at a neighbor's house at the base of South Mountain. She was 14 years old, barefoot and trembling. What she told the authorities that day would set in motion the largest child sexual abuse investigation in Canadian history up to that point. She described a world that shouldn't exist in the 20th century, a place where children were treated as property, where fathers raped daughters, where uncles assaulted nieces, where the concept of childhood innocence had been extinguished generations ago. She spoke of rituals of abuse so routine they were treated as normal. She described being forced to perform sexual acts with multiple family members, sometimes while others watched. She talked about younger children, some barely able to walk, being subjected to the same horrors. And she named names, lots of names, all carrying the surname Goler. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police initially struggled to believe the scope of what they were hearing. This wasn't a single predator or even a small ring of abusers. This was an entire community structure built around the exploitation of children. A system that had apparently operated for decades without intervention. But as investigators began interviewing other children who had escaped the mountain or been placed in foster care, the girl's story was corroborated again and again. Each child told variations of the same nightmare, a childhood defined by sexual violence, physical brutality, and complete isolation from the outside world. These weren't exaggerations or false memories. These were testimonies that matched in their specific, horrifying details. What made the Goler case particularly disturbing was the generational nature of the abuse. This wasn't a single monster operating in secret. This was a multi-generational system where victims became perpetrators, where children who were abused grew up to abuse their own children. creating a cycle that had been repeating itself since at least the early 1900s. The family had become so isolated, so insular, that the outside world's rules simply didn't apply anymore. Up on that mountain, a different reality had taken root, one where children existed solely for the gratification of adults, where incest wasn't taboo but routine, where violence was the language everyone spoke. And because the Golers kept to themselves, because they threatened outsiders who got too curious, this parallel world had survived decades longer than it should have. The investigation that followed would eventually identify over 130 victims, spanning 3 generations. 130 children who had been born into a nightmare they didn't know they could escape. The origins of the Goler family's isolation trace back to Charles Goler himself, a man whose life remains largely mysterious even now. What little is known suggests he arrived in Nova Scotia sometime in the late 19th century, settling in the remote South Mountain region where land was cheap and questions were few. Charles had children, multiple children, and those children had children of their own. But somewhere in those early generations, the family began to close in on itself. Whether it was poverty, geographic isolation, cultural factors, or something darker in Charles Goler's own character, the family stopped marrying outsiders. Cousins married cousins. Siblings entered into relationships that produced children with severe genetic abnormalities. The family tree didn't branch outward. It looped back on itself, creating a genetic tangle that would have devastating consequences for every generation that followed. By the 1940s and 1950s, the Goler Clan had developed a reputation in the surrounding communities as people to avoid. They were known for violence, for their hostility toward outsiders, and for the strange appearance of their children. Local doctors, who occasionally treated Goler family members, noted unusually high rates of mental disabilities, physical deformities, and cognitive impairments, all classic markers of sustained inbreeding. But in rural Nova Scotia during the mid-20th century, there was little appetite for intervention. The Golers were left alone, and that isolation allowed the abuse to metastasize. Without outside oversight, without children attending school regularly, without social workers able to gain access to the mountain community, there was no mechanism to stop what was happening. The family had created its own kingdom of horrors, and the throne passed from one generation to the next. The structure of abuse within the Goler clan wasn't random or chaotic. It was systematic. Adult males held absolute authority, and that authority included sexual access to any child in the family. Mothers who had themselves been victims as children often facilitated the abuse of their own offspring, having been so thoroughly broken by their own experiences that they could no longer recognize the horror of what was happening. Children were taught from infancy that their bodies belonged to the adults around them, that resistance would be met with brutal violence, and that the outside world would never believe them even if they did speak. This wasn't just abuse, it was the complete psychological destruction of childhood itself, replacing normal development with a system of terror and exploitation that left survivors so damaged that many would struggle to function in normal society even after rescue. What's particularly chilling is how long this system survived. From roughly the 1920s through 1984, 3 full generations of children grew up in this environment. 60+ years of systematic sexual violence, hidden behind geographic isolation and a wall of family silence that seemed impenetrable. Until one girl found the courage to walk down that mountain and tell the truth. When police finally obtained warrants to search the properties on South Mountain in the summer of 1984, what they found exceeded even their worst expectations. The living conditions alone were nightmarish. Homes without running water or electricity, rooms filled with human waste, children sleeping on filthy mattresses, crawling with insects, and a pervasive stench of decay that officers would later say haunted them for years. But the physical squalor was nothing compared to the human wreckage. Children were discovered who couldn't speak in complete sentences, who flinched at any sudden movement, who had been so thoroughly trained to submit to adult demands that they seemed almost catatonic. Some of the youngest victims couldn't articulate what had been done to them. They simply didn't have the language or the conceptual framework to understand that what they'd experienced wasn't normal. The medical examinations told the story their words couldn't. Doctors found evidence of repeated sexual trauma in children as young as 5 years old, injuries that could only have resulted from sustained abuse over months or years. Some children had sexually transmitted diseases. Others showed signs of malnutrition and untreated injuries that had healed incorrectly, leaving permanent damage. The forensic evidence painted a picture of a community where children's bodies were used and discarded with less care than one might give to livestock. And as investigators interviewed more family members, the scope of the conspiracy became clear. Virtually every adult in the clan either participated in the abuse, facilitated it, or remained silent about it. There were no innocent bystanders on that mountain. Everyone knew. Everyone was complicit. The perpetrators themselves showed a disturbing lack of remorse when confronted. Many couldn't understand why outsiders were making such a fuss about what they considered normal family behavior. They'd grown up in this system, had been victimized by it themselves as children, and had internalized the abuse so thoroughly that they genuinely didn't recognize it as criminal. Some claimed they thought this was how all families operated, that the sexual exploitation of children was simply what adults did behind closed doors. This wasn't a defense, but it revealed something even more disturbing. The Goler clan had been isolated for so long that they'd developed their own moral universe, one where the most fundamental taboos of civilization had been completely erased. They weren't just criminals. They were people who had been raised in a place where normal human ethics had ceased to exist. The prosecution would eventually charge 16 adults with a combined total of over 100 counts of sexual assault, rape, and incest. The trials would drag on for years, revealing details so horrific that the judge ordered certain testimony sealed to protect the public from the full extent of the depravity. But even with those protections, enough emerged to shock a nation and raise impossible questions about how such evil could flourish for so long in a modern country. The trials of the Goler clan members began in 1985 and stretched across several years, becoming a media sensation that forced Canadians to confront uncomfortable truths about what could happen in their own backyard. The courtroom testimony was so disturbing that journalists struggled to report on it without violating standards of decency. Victims, many of them still children, took the stand and described in halting, traumatized voices what had been done to them. They spoke of being passed between relatives like objects, of being threatened with death if they told anyone, of watching younger siblings suffer the same fate, and being powerless to intervene. Defense attorneys tried to discredit the children's testimony, suggesting they'd been coached or were fabricating stories, but the sheer volume of consistent accounts and the physical evidence made such arguments impossible to sustain. What emerged during the trials was a hierarchy of abuse within the family. Certain men were identified as the primary perpetrators, individuals who wielded absolute power within the clan and used it to access any child they wanted. But the women weren't innocent either. Several mothers were convicted of facilitating abuse, of holding down their own children while male relatives assaulted them, of punishing children who resisted or threatened to tell. The psychological damage required to turn a mother into an accomplice in her own child's rape is almost incomprehensible. But that's what the Goler system had achieved. It had so thoroughly destroyed normal human bonding that even maternal instinct had been perverted into something monstrous. The trials revealed that some of the worst abuse occurred during what the family called parties, gatherings where multiple adults would sexually assault children while others watched and waited their turn. These weren't spontaneous acts of violence. They were organized events, rituals of degradation that had become part of the family's social structure. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? In the end, 16 adults were convicted, receiving sentences ranging from a few years to life imprisonment. But many observers felt justice had been inadequate. Most of the convicted perpetrators served relatively short sentences. Some were released after just a few years, returning to Nova Scotia and living out their lives in relative anonymity. The victims, meanwhile, received life sentences of their own in the form of psychological trauma that would never fully heal. Many struggled with addiction, mental illness, and an inability to form healthy relationships. Some died young, their lives cut short by the damage inflicted during childhood. A few managed to build relatively normal lives, but even they carried scars that never quite faded. The Goler case raised profound questions about justice. How do you adequately punish people who destroyed dozens of lives? How do you rehabilitate someone who was raised in a system so broken that they never learned basic human empathy? And how do you help victims recover from trauma so severe that it rewired their fundamental understanding of human relationships? The answer, uncomfortable as it may be, is that you can't, not fully. Some damage is permanent. Some evil is too profound to fix. The aftermath of the Goler case forced Canadian authorities to confront systematic failures that had allowed the abuse to continue for generations. Social workers who had attempted to investigate the mountain community testified that they'd been blocked at every turn, threatened with violence, denied access to homes, and told by supervisors not to push too hard because the Golers were difficult, and kept to themselves. Teachers reported that they'd filed concerns about Goler children showing signs of abuse, only to have those reports seemingly disappear into bureaucratic black holes. Local doctors admitted they'd suspected something was terribly wrong, but hadn't wanted to get involved in what they saw as a family matter. The pattern was clear. Everyone who could have intervened chose not to, and that collective failure allowed unspeakable horrors to continue for decades. The institutions designed to protect children had simply looked the other way. What made the institutional failure even more damning was that it wasn't unique to the Goler case. As the story gained national attention, other isolated communities across Canada came under scrutiny, revealing similar patterns of multi-generational abuse hidden behind geographic isolation and bureaucratic indifference. The Goler Clan wasn't an aberration. It was an extreme example of what happens when vulnerable populations fall through the cracks of society. The case prompted reforms in child protection services, mandatory reporting laws, and increased funding for rural social work programs. But for the victims of the Goler Clan, these changes came too late. They'd already lived through hell while the outside world chose ignorance over action. The psychological research that emerged from studying Goler survivors revealed disturbing insights into how sustained abuse across multiple generations affects human development. Many victims displayed symptoms of complex post-traumatic stress disorder so severe that they struggled to distinguish between past trauma and present reality. Some had difficulty understanding that the abuse they'd experienced wasn't normal, even years after being removed from the mountain. Their sense of self had been so thoroughly shattered during childhood that rebuilding it proved nearly impossible. Therapists working with survivors reported that traditional trauma treatment methods were often inadequate. These weren't people who'd experienced a discrete traumatic event. They were people whose entire developmental period had been one continuous trauma with no safe attachment figures and no concept of normal human relationships. Some survivors spoke of feeling like they'd been born into the wrong species, that they watched normal people interact with a mixture of confusion and envy, never quite able to replicate the emotional connections that others took for granted. Perhaps most tragically, the cycle of abuse didn't completely end with the arrests. Some survivors, despite receiving therapy and support, went on to perpetuate similar patterns with their own children, demonstrating how deeply trauma can embed itself into behavior and psychology. Breaking a multi-generational cycle of abuse requires more than just removing people from an abusive environment. It requires fundamentally rewiring patterns of thought and behavior that were established before conscious memory even began. Today, the mountain where the Goler Clan once lived stands mostly abandoned. The ramshackle homes and trailers have been torn down or left to rot into the forest floor. Nature is slowly reclaiming the land, covering over the physical evidence of what happened there. But the psychological scars remain indelible. The surviving victims are scattered across Canada now, most living under assumed names, trying to build lives from the wreckage of their childhoods. Some have succeeded in creating families of their own, breaking the cycle through sheer force of will and extensive therapy. Others never recovered, succumbing to addiction, suicide, or lives marked by homelessness and mental illness. The Goler case remains one of the most disturbing examples of familial abuse in Canadian history. A reminder that monsters don't always hide in the shadows. Sometimes they hide in plain sight, protected by isolation, silence, and society's unwillingness to confront uncomfortable truths. The case also serves as a stark warning about the dangers of extreme isolation. The Goler Clan wasn't destroyed by poverty or lack of resources. It was destroyed by its own insularity, by turning so far inward that it lost all connection to the moral and ethical standards of the broader society. When communities become too isolated, when they develop their own internal rules that contradict basic human decency, the results can be catastrophic. The victims of the Goler Clan were failed not just by their family members, but by every institution and individual who chose to look away rather than confront what was happening on that mountain. Their suffering was preventable, and that makes it all the more tragic. What lessons can be drawn from such darkness? Perhaps the most important is that evil rarely announces itself openly. It festers in silence, in places where people are afraid to look, in situations that seem too complicated or too disturbing to address. The bureaucrats who ignored warning signs, the teachers who didn't push harder when their concerns were dismissed, the neighbors who heard rumors but said nothing. They weren't evil people, but their inaction enabled evil to flourish. The Goler case teaches us that protection of the vulnerable requires more than good intentions. It requires courage, persistence, and a willingness to act even when it's uncomfortable or inconvenient. The story of the Goler Clan is not one with a satisfying ending. There's no redemption arc, no moment where justice fully prevails, no way to undo the damage inflicted on so many innocent lives. It's simply a dark chapter in history, a reminder of humanity's capacity for cruelty when left unchecked by social oversight and moral accountability. The mountain is quiet now, but the echoes of what happened there continue to reverberate through the lives of survivors and through the collective conscience of a nation that failed to protect its most vulnerable citizens. Some stories don't end. They just fade into the landscape, leaving behind only questions we're still trying to answer and wounds that may never fully heal. The Goler Clan is one of those stories, a piece of buried history that refuses to stay buried, demanding that we remember not just what happened, but how it was allowed to happen, and what we must do to ensure nothing like it ever happens again.